Welcome to ALLFIE Hustings, and what I'd like to do before we begin is just to make an acknowledgement, ground rules, timings of the event, and apologies again for running slightly delayed, and I'd like to make some closing comments. But before I do that, Tara's going to make a couple of announcements.
Yeah, just housekeeping really. I'm Tara, but I'm ALLFIE's director. So I'm guessing because lots of people have been here for quite a while, people might know where the loos are, but I'll tell you. So if you go out of the room here and turn right, towards the end of the corridor, there's an accessible loo on your left-hand side, and then ladies and gents through a door with a window in it. Tea and coffee is next door, as everybody knows, and cakes. There'll be a break halfway through, so people can go and get the water drink if you want to. If there is a fire, obviously if we're kind of outside of this house now, we isn't going to be a test of the alarm. So if it does go off, it'll be real. And basically, it's very simple. It's just going back. There's only one exit out of the building, and it's the same as the exit that you came into. Okay. All right. I think that's it.
Thank you very much. Some of you will know, earlier this year, I'm chair of ALLFIE, Line for Inclusive Education, and I just want to make an announcement about the acknowledgement of the hard work of staff, of ALLFIE staff, to make this hustings event happen, and the perseverance of the staff. And again, having been to various hustings, about understanding about the difficulties of bringing these events to bear. So, just a sincere thank you to ALLFIE staff for making this happen. I need to say as well that after 3 months of persistent phone calls, communication with political representatives from the Conservative Party, we've not had any response in terms of somebody being representing Conservative viewpoint manifesto about education. So it's disappointing that that's occurred today. Again, we had an apology early this morning from a UKIP representative due to ill health, unable to attend. And again, we have, although Jonathan to my right and Steve to my left from the Greens Party and Labour. Also, not heard from Liberal Democrats. Spokesperson. We have left a message. They may turn up later, but we'll continue as best as we can and accommodate if that person turns up. So, the ground rules. I hope you've made yourself familiar with the ground rules, but just being general, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. But primarily speak through myself as chair of this hustings. I know that you will have specific questions, and they'll be present for you, as they will be for most of us. And I ask for your patience to ask questions and give people an opportunity to be able to communicate the questions to the panel. I also want to say that to allow individuals to be able to say things that you may fundamentally disagree with, and that we sort of respect those particular viewpoints. So the key point of the ground rules is refrain from personal attacks. If you are going to use jargon in educational speak, please do clarify the jargon that you're making. If you're using acronyms, letters for abbreviations, please do make them clear. The timings of the proceedings then will be as follows. That each particular representative will be given approximately 5 minutes to state the particular proposals with regards to education. After that, there will be opportunity to ask questions, and I will take questions, approximately 3-4 at a time, depending upon the theme of each of the questions. And I anticipate us having a short break midway between as a comfort break, and then to return later for the political representative to wrap up. And again, that will take about 4 minutes to wrap up. And then finally, I'll make some comments. So, in the spirit of this particular hustings, we'll begin. And so, I ask either one of you to...
Extra full music.
Do you want to go first then? I'm quite happy to start. Well, good evening. My name is Steve McCabe. I'm the Labour Shadow Minister for Children and Families, and my brief covers special education needs, children in care, social work training, fostering and adoption. So it's quite a wide brief. And obviously tonight I'm assuming you want me to focus primarily on issues to do with education for what we tend, since you told me about jargon, I think to call SEND these days, by which I mean special education needs and disabilities. Now, the starting point for me would be that we've had a fairly landmark piece of legislation with the Children and Families Act in this Parliament. Personally, we have no plans if Labour wins the election to overturn or radically change that piece of legislation. What we do think is crucial is whether or not that legislation actually does what it says on the tin. It actually appears on the surface to confer quite a lot of new rights for people. For example, it extends the age from birthright up to 25. It gives parents and young people massive say over their education choice, over the access to other services. It gives people rights with education, health and care plans that should be much more detailed in terms of being an assessment of an individual's needs. So, in essence, we have no plans to overturn that, but the key of that legislation, as I say, is that it does what it says on the tin, and so we will concentrate on the implementation of the Act. That's my #1 priority, and we plan to do that by setting up a small implementation unit within the Department for Education, and we want to concentrate most of our energy on two aspects: the code of practice, because that would seem to be where most of the issues about people's rights and the application of them are contained, and the local offer, which is really the issue about what services are available and who you get access to them. And from my personal point of view, I think that's the two things that are going to govern whether or not the legislation actually works. I should confess, in my dim and distant past, was once a social worker, so I've got plenty of experience of Children's Acts and Children and Families Acts, some of which never got off the shelf, and big chunks of which were never operationalised. So that may explain why I'm putting an emphasis on this aspect of it. In terms of other areas that you might want me to focus on, I mean, the other things I just want to say quickly are that I think that we would want to put a much higher emphasis on early screening, early identification for particular conditions, and the reason for that is, as I probably don't need to say to most people here, but all the evidence I read, all the things I'm told, all the things I see, tell me that there are many people who spend far too long looking for an explanation, looking for a diagnosis, and then trying to get onto the path to find the kind of support that will be most useful. And of course, in some cases, in things that maybe affect the capacity to walk, sit up, speech, language, communication, then the delays actually mean that people are set back significantly and could make much greater progress. So that's why we would put the emphasis on that particular area. There's a particular issue about people with special education needs or disabilities as they hit the 16 mark, because if you've been fortunate enough to get your child into a decent kind of school, often after quite a lot of struggle in most cases, what happens is 16 is a major transition, and quite often people don't have anywhere decent to go. Lots of FE colleges, not really that brilliant in that respect. So we want to look, specifically at that. And then the final part, which you wouldn't want me to avoid, I'm very clear that you're about inclusive education. What we say is that we are not going to say it has to be specialist schools are all inclusive. What we're going to say is that where specialist schools provide good quality specialist provision, we will retain that, but we expect them to work as main support centres for mainstream schools around them, so that the level of support and backup is available to all staff, and therefore the reality of children going to a mainstream school has a high chance of success rather than the rather extensive level of failures that we witness at the moment with things like illegal exclusion, staff unable to cope or understand. So we would want a balance between the two. And I think that's you telling me it's time to stop. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. For some people, the Green Party is going to be new. Won't know much about our education policies. I'm probably one of the few people that joined the Green Party because of its education policies. You've heard from Labour that there won't be much change under a Labour government to the situation now. The Green Party's position is different. We believe there should be a bias toward inclusion, quite simply. And I'm involved in I'm a work and pension spokesman for the Green Party. I've got, in the manifesto, I've seen it, it will be the absolute right, stated in black and white, to an inclusive education, will be in the Green Party manifesto. You aren't going to get a great deal from Labour because they aren't really doing anything different to the Tories. The Green Party is completely different in that respect, and we will put the resources, we would want to put the resources into the education system because it desperately needs them. And where you've seen UKIP shift the Tories and Labour to the right, a vote for the Green Party shifts the Tories and Labour in the right direction as far as we're concerned, against austerity and for inclusive education and for putting the resources into the education system. And I think in this election, that is why a lot more people are voting Green. They're voting for what they believe in, and they aren't any longer being told by the main parties that's a wasted vote. People are turning around, sticking two fingers up and saying, oh no, it isn't, because they represent what I actually believe in. So what will we do? Financial transaction tax, a Robin Hood tax that Labour once stood for, we'd impose it. £20 billion would go into the budget from that. Wealth tax on the richest 1%. It's debatable how much that would raise. We'd say probably about 20 or 30 billion. Others would say maybe 5 or 10 billion. The fact is it's an awful lot of money. We'd raise the top rate of income tax to 60% on those owning over 100,000 a year. That would raise another 2 billion a year. We wouldn't replace Trident, so we'd have another 100 billion a year, 100 billion over 30 years, I'm sorry. But most crucially, we'd increase corporation tax on big businesses, that's over 250 employees, to a G8 level, a G8 average of 30%, and that would bring in around 3 or 4 billion a year, would allow us to reverse the abolition of tuition fees, allows us to abolish tuition fees and reintroduce maintenance grants. We believe that education should be free right the way through, right through to university, and we believe you've got to pay for it. There's no magic wand, you can't suddenly conjure up money from nowhere. You've got to tax the rich if you want to do it, and we will do it, and we are the only party that would do that. We're also the only party committed to ending the culture of testing and league tables in our schools, which is also, in the words of someone who spoke to me recently, Labour built a bridge over which the Tories are marching towards the privatisation of our education system. They introduced the internal market in the NHS, they've introduced the market within schools. We would get rid of it, we wouldn't just stop it, we would reverse it. We don't believe that the role of education is to create economic units to compete in a global marketplace. That is not the role of education. It is to provide a well-rounded, flourishing environment where children of all abilities, of all ages can learn together, can flourish together and pursue their interests, not just to compete in the capitalist market. As long as you see the current approach in education, you won't get full inclusion. That's the reality. As long as you have a system which is based upon league tables and testing, children will be discarded and excluded and fallen by the wayside. It's that fundamental to our education system. I'll give you an example of that. My son is a wheelchair user. We fought 2 years to get him into our local school. When he finally got there and he had his first sports day, he lined up to run the 100 metres. Of course, he can't run the 100 metres, he uses a powered wheelchair. And the starting gun goes, and all the kids in his class run up the track, and they haven't twigged that his powered wheelchair can only go half as fast as the other kids can run. So the penultimate child crosses the finishing line, and I'm thinking to myself, what's going to happen here? And there's a silence, and then suddenly the attention shifts to Samuel, and he's halfway down the tracks, pushing his joystick forward as fast as he possibly can, and someone starts to chant his name, and then another one starts to chant his name, and they start to go, Samuel, Samuel, until he's across the finishing line. Any parent here will know that you tell your kids it's not about the winning, it's about the taking part that really matters. And deep down inside, we all rather like it when our kids win. But I can honestly say that at that moment, at that time in that school, it became about the taking part, not the winning. And that's what happens when you have a fully inclusive environment. Things start to change, the values start to change, and the culture of testing starts to change. I've got about 30 seconds left. What else would we do? We would start education later. We started at 6 or 7, like they do on the continent. We want smaller class sizes, and we can fund them because we are taxing the rich. We reduce them to 20. We'd have academic learning starting from about 6 or 7 years old, but childcare extended right down to much earlier on. We'd abolish SATs and league tables. We'll introduce, we'll get our academies and our grammar schools back under local authority control. We'll have a fully comprehensive system. So in the place of Ofsted, you'd have a system of local authority control with parents and teachers and children. That's crucially involved in that. We restore the education maintenance allowance for 16 to 17-year-olds. Imagine an education system like that. I'll tell you what, there's only one way we're ever going to get it, and that is that people vote for what they believe in.
Okay, guests. Questions? Take 3 questions first of all.
Hi, my name is Lizzie Goff. I'm here in personal capacity, but I work for Achievement for All, which is an educational charity working on raising achievements of children with special education needs and disabilities. My question is, the Coalition have moved to end of course exams and linear exams and abolished coursework. In what ways do you feel that specifically helps or hinders young people with special needs?
Janet?
Yeah. Based on, I've read through your manifestos, none of you say anything about the educational and healthcare plan. And as a mother to my son, one of the questions are based on the rights of local authorities ignoring fundamental SEND policy. As I see it, local authorities are not adhering to the law. And clearly none of them are educated or trained in the law. Hence, most of all cases are sent, end up either at tribunal or judicial review. The main purpose of this here is 2 things. How will the local authorities be trained? Number 1. And number 2 is, how is the cost associated to taking these cases to court justified when this money could clearly be used on the provision for our children? I cannot seem to understand that. I really struggle with that.
Thank you, Janet. Then Richard.
Yeah, Richard Reader, World Inclusion. I'm concerned at Labour's position that they think that things are more or less right in the legislation. We spent a lot of time in the 90s trying to get rid of pernicious elements of the SEN legislation, which were being used against parents' wishes, where parents wanted mainstream school and they weren't being allowed into mainstream school because of the cost of the particular measure, or that the school couldn't meet appropriate needs. Estelle Morris, who was Secretary of State, agreed to get rid of those two, and the 2001 SEN Disability Act took them out. So there was only one caveat left, which was if it would interfere with the efficient education of other children. Otherwise, parents, if they wished the mainstream school, could have one. Unfortunately, the Children and Families Act has brought back 5 caveats, which all head teachers can now exercise to stop parents who want their children in mainstream schools being there. And I'm very worried about this, particularly with the lack of local authority or any central control over more than 70% of our schools now fix their own admissions policy. So these are that a school can reject a child because of its SEN, which seems to go against the Equalities Act. They can reject because the child has the wrong aptitude or ability. They can reject because they can't offer appropriate education. They can reject because the child will costume match. Or, the one that was there, they can also reject because a child will interfere with the efficient education of other children. I don't see how Labour can say they're not going to actually fundamentally review a policy which, true to Mr Cameron, the coalition view, was drafted to get rid of the bias towards inclusion. That is the stated policy of the coalition. As far as I understood, it wasn't the policy of Labour, so Labour surely has to get itself into position to change that, to actually make it possible for parents to have choice. I'd like to go further than that, but even to let's get back to choice, because that is now very much loaded against parents who want mainstream schools.
All three. Okay. Well, sorry, can we take them one at a time, because there's a lot in there. I'm struggling to.
Yeah. Can I just encapsulate, and please, again, this is a summary of what I've heard. I'm sure people may have heard different things. From Linda about end of course examinations and the assessment culture. From Janet around SEND policy, about tribunals and the cost justifying LEA staff being trained in this policy area. And Richard's question around legislation, about caveat, about the New Children and Families Act, about no reintroducing additional criteria in which a young person might find themselves not attending mainstream education, and the issue of parental choice. I hope that's encapsulated those three. So, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Linda on the end of year exams. I mean, you know, they're going to be absolutely useless for my son. You know, he needs a differentiated curriculum. He needs to do his coursework at his own pace. And that is how he's going to learn, and that is how he's going to flourish. And moving towards, you know, end of course exams just seems to be an ideological, you know, move. Right, it was Gove that originally announced it, wasn't it? Because he wants to go back to a bygone era where he thinks we should all take exams. I mean, there's no merit in it, the idea, and I think it is a barrier, and totally don't support it. In terms of the education, health and care plans, Janet, I was really worried when they came in, because we're committed to the social model of disability. That will be absolutely clear in our manifesto in black and white. And by running health and care into education, it takes it much more down the medical model route. And so that's a real concern. In terms of the training for local authorities, they desperately need it. I think that part of this is a resourcing issue, and all local authorities are, you know, being absolutely squeezed, and SEN departments are being squeezed. I mean, all the inclusion positions in my council, Lambeth, have been kind of abolished, and there's no inclusion positions any longer, let alone training for local authorities and how these things are being dealt with. And I think the only way is to fight back, and it is to get the funding that's necessary for local authorities. You know, the Green Party would put another 2 bans on council tax, you know, and we'd get that money in for local authorities. desperately needs to be done. I think training of teaching assistants is desperately needed. You know, a good teaching assistant in the school as well is like gold dust. You know, it has been. We've had good teaching assistants and bad teaching assistants, and it makes this the world of difference to a child being supported and empowered, and the barriers being removed for that child's education. But also crucial to it is bringing the local authority, the schools all under local authority control, which Richard is highlighting. I was the second meeting with Michael Gove after 2010. His first meeting was with the Church of England, which is interesting. I was the second meeting. I went in and I sat in and I took in Mish and other people. We went in to see Mr. Gove and we sat down and said, okay, how's your academy's policy going to work? What happens if I want to appeal a decision along the lines that Richard has talked about? And he turned to one of his advisors and says, what does happen? He didn't know his own policy. It was being made up on the hoof, and he turned around and said, Secretary of State, what happens is that it will come across your desk and the appeal will come right to the Secretary of State. And that was the policy being made up on the hoof. There's no local accountability there. It needs to be sorted out. It needs to be addressed. Richard, all I can say is I'm totally with you. There are more barriers now. We have moved away from even a system of choice. We have to be pragmatic about what the next government will do. It's going to have to be push them back in the direction of at least a level playing field rather than a slanted playing field, which we now find ourselves in. But I'm not sure that Labour are going to produce that as things stand. I don't know what's in the Labour Party manifesto. The manifestos haven't been published yet. They come out in a week's time. So the stuff that we've got here is just a cut and paste from the policy on the website, which goes back in the Green Party case 30 odd years. I've seen our manifesto. I can tell you a bit about what's in it, but maybe Labour can address your issues. I'll be very sad if we can't.
Thank you.
Linda, the specific point about coursework, I mean, this doesn't just apply to youngsters with special needs. There's a whole raft of subjects where the abolition of coursework makes no sense at all. Take something like chemistry, for example. It's rather preposterous. So, I mean, I don't think there's really much of an issue on that. That was wrong. We will be seeking to address that aspect of it. But obviously for youngsters with quite a spectrum of needs, there are other elements attached to assessment. There's actually the question about the extra time that should be allocated for children. There's a whole issue at the moment about access to support equipment or support persons to help them in that respect. They're all kind of issues that have kind of been sidelined by focusing too extensively on an end result exam, and that's something that we wouldn't be partly to. We'd be looking to make the appropriate changes in. I have to say that I don't wholly, if I can just pick up Jan's point, I don't wholly accept that education, health and care plans are exclusively a medical model. Each to their own on that, but actually a lot of parents I speak to, although they're worried about how they'll be implemented, they're worried about the way the assessments will be conducted, they're worried about arguments of whether or not affordability will weigh really against need. They actually quite like the fact that there is an effort being made to try and bring the disparate parts of the local authority and the education function and some of the health needs together. And in fact, in the past, those of you who've had experience of the statementing system will actually know what it's like about going through the various hurdles where you deal with one aspect of your child's needs and then you have to turn and face in an entirely different direction to deal with the other aspects. So I'm not sure that that is actually such a terrible idea. The real test of that will be the quality of the assessments. Now, the truth is we don't actually know enough about how well that's working at the moment. I put down some parliamentary questions fairly recently to ask what data they've been able to collect, and you won't be surprised to hear that we've got precious little. I think the department's not got a very good mechanism for collecting data, but given the period of time, they haven't got much. Most of the information I've got is anecdotal. And actually the truth is, it seems already to be there seems to be some variety across the country. There are some examples where people are saying it is working well and better. There are some examples where people are essentially just substituting the term education, health and care plans for what was a good old-fashioned statement process, and they're not good. Clearly there is a need for training, but actually there's a need for, and this was the part I was trying to stress about the Act and why I don't share the view that I would write it off. You have to remember, this is an Act that was quite a long time in development. I'd actually went through substantial changes in the House of Lords to produce a rather better piece of legislation than the current government originally envisaged. But I think we need to know more about the way the assessments are being conducted and where the shortfall lies. And that's why I said to you that I thought a key element was to have an implementation team that could actually make an assessment of what's happening around the country, could learn from things like parent support groups, parent participation groups, where there are actually deficiencies, and tackle.
I think John's question is related to the cost and can
I'm coming, but we did talk about that, and we did hear that there were just a medical model analysis dealing with that. The question
about I said moving us towards a medical model.
Okay, well, let's not get too into it. On the question of tribunals, I mean, actually it's a total waste. One of the problems actually with local authorities, which makes me always sceptical when people talk about them as if there is a golden age of local authority benevolence. Local authorities at times have been more than happy to see parents driven to tribunals. They've been happier to see money spent on the cost and the fees and the administration for tribunals than it would have cost to sort out the issue in the first place. And that, that is actually a problem. If you spend more energy in trying to actually negotiate a satisfactory settlement with people, instead of driving them towards a tribunal and an appeal system, you would actually possibly get a better deal. That money, and I think the implication of your question was that, is that dead money, is it wasted money? Well, of course it is, because it's money that could be spent on children and young people. Instead, it's being consumed in fees and administrative costs, often by local authorities who are playing a game of who's going to blink first with the parent. And then I just want to deal with the last point that Richard made about the issue of exclusions from mainstream. Look, for a start, we've already kind of acknowledged that we will almost certainly have to revise the admissions code at the point that we were elected, if that was the case. Secondly, it is the case that there is this huge gulf at the moment between what happens with local schools and the Secretary of State, especially for the opted-out sector like academies or free schools. As I said a second ago, I'm a Birmingham MP, so I've got to tell you my experience isn't that there's a totally golden situation with local education authorities out there. London's got a much better story to tell because London has actually benefited from the London Challenge over a number of years, which actually, of course, was set up by the last Labour government. But London has got a better story to tell. If you go around the country, it's not quite the same. So I am slightly more sceptical about thinking everything will be resolved if we returned everything to standard local authority control. What we do need is something between the Secretary of State and local schools and local decision making. And of course what we're looking at there is a Director of Innovation and Standards so that we can try to actually pull some of those things together. And there are various things that we need to look at there for children who are in care. There's a much bigger role for virtual heads to play in terms of what kind of access children with special needs and disabilities get. Once we were able to start that principle and that ball rolling, then why not extend it to all parents? And of course, the key issue in that is to get away from this idea that schools are isolated economic units. But the key, they don't have to move from being in the current situation to being back under local authority control to work as families of schools. And our view is it would be much better if schools, primarily on geographic grounds, but there may be other circumstances where schools would want to work together as well. Much better if schools are encouraged to work as families in networks of schools. That's the principle, again, that has worked quite strongly with the London Challenge. It's the principle that Tim Brickhouse, who in the one period I can remember in recent years, when Birmingham did well in education, brought to London. And of course, the person who worked with him to develop that was Estelle Morris, both as a Birmingham MP, then as the Secretary of State, and then when she went to the House of Lords. So, you know, we've got some examples of where some of this stuff has worked well in the past, and that's the stuff that we're going to build on.
Thank you. Right.
I didn't get an answer to my question.
What is the answer you didn't get that you required?
The answer is that you're going to actually bring in primary legislation to remove the legislation that was built on prejudice that was brought through by the Tories and your party ignored.
The caveat.
The caveats are a major attack on the rights of parents who want mainstream schools, and we've lobbied and lobbied and lobbied throughout the long period, as you said, of the bill, and nobody took any notice of this. But that is how it's working out, particularly where you don't have any control over head teachers anymore because their academies a lot more.
Well, as I've just said to you, we have plans to bring academies back within the families and schools. We think we will have more influence and more control over that. I'm not going to lie to curry favour and tell you we're going to bring in primary legislation for what you want. I'd be making it up, that's not true. But I believe that by reviewing the admissions code and taking the necessary steps where we see that there are problems, we will be able to address some, I can't guarantee all, some of your concerns.
Thank you. Questions? One from Lillian, Teresa, and Harry.
Can I just say, from all of us, I think that we really do appreciate the two people who have come to this meeting. Yes. I'm disappointed that some others have not come. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your answers to your questions. First issue, I think that most people here, I might be wrong, but I think most people here and out of this room are warm towards the approach to education and changes that the Green Party wish to make, and would like to know what Labour's response to that is. But the other thing I wanted to say is this coalition government has created huge inequalities within our education system. So segregation, discrimination has become much more, there is more discrimination. Exclusion, which has already been mentioned by Richard, and selection, because we've got autonomous schools with their own admissions policies. So I'm glad to hear from Steve that the Labour Party would look at the admissions code and hopefully revise it. But I'd really like to know from both parties whether they will be prepared to end selection and end exclusion. There are other countries that do not exclude young people at all, and we know that both of those, selection and exclusion, have greater effect, that's not very well expressed, on children with special education needs and disabilities. It affects them even more so, but also different ethnic groups and so on. So I'd like to know what the party's views are on that.
Thank you, Teresa.
Yeah, my name is Teresa. I wanted to ask a question, especially around parents who are English as a second language and who don't understand the scholastic system, how they work, and understand the importance of inclusive education for disabled children to have friendship and social skills that if they did go to special schools they would not gain. And how would you, which party would make that commitment that they'd be interpreters for these parents and have training for these parents so that they understand the importance of this inclusive education?
Thank you, Teresa.
Fiona.
Sorry, Fiona.
That's okay. Hello, my name's Fiona England. I'm the parent. I've got 3 children, but my middle son has got Down syndrome and a severe learning disability. He attends mainstream school. My question mainly picks up on training. It terrifies me really to think of how much money the Children and Families Bill must have cost to implement. I've been involved locally with the Pathfinders right from the beginning. I can see the aims and aspirations of the bill. I'm yet to be convinced whether it's all been worth it. But however, there's one key area that I want to ask you about, and it's a 2-part question really, is despite the Children's and Families Bill, do you think it is acceptable for children with the most complex needs to be taught by the least trained staff in mainstream schools? And then to follow up with that is what intentions do both your parties have to train teachers? Every single year my son has a new teacher who is delighted by the challenge of having him in the class, delighted by the challenge and also terrified by the challenge and whispering in corners that they haven't been trained to teach my son. At some point throughout the year, the teacher will feel empowered by the fact that she or he can actually embark on this task. Now, I'm bored of this. I want the teacher to be empowered before my son goes into the new year. This is happening every single year. My son is 11. He is taught by teaching assistants who earn far too little money and don't have the training. My 9-year-old daughter is taught by qualified teachers. This is not fair. So you have to bring it right back to the beginning. When teachers go to teacher training college, why aren't they trained? And adding on to that, we need training in inclusion for teachers, and we need training in the Equality Act, as this lady says, with local authority people being trained in the law. Thank you.
Just to encapsulate your opinion about Labour's response to Green's specific comments on education, we mentioned issues of inequality, discrimination and rising trends around exclusion. The end selection within that. Sarifa's question around parents who have English as additional language to support such individuals through the schooling system. Particular concerns about developing social networks, friendships, and for parents to have interpreters, and issues of training, if I heard you correctly. And Fiona, about drawing upon personal experience, issues of training cost, being on the path to find a course, suggesting that least trained staff working with her son, and what is the political representative's views about the intention for teacher training, and again, many parents' experience of feeling bored that they once again have to find themselves through their son or daughter, almost like this new person in the class, almost as though it's a new quest for them, and we know that through ALLFIE's members. And so Fiona's question directly is, why aren't they trained? Steve, if I ask you on this occasion.
Okay, sure. Well, I mean, I think you've heard what the Green view of the Labour Party is. That's fairly dismissive and says we're just like the Tory Party. I'd say actually, for me, the Green Party reminds me a bit of an Ursula Le Guin or a Marge Piercy novel. It's, it's very romantic, and if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And I think that's the essential problem with Green policy. Bits and pieces I could buy into, like anyone else here. Do I believe it's real? No, I don't actually. In terms of the issue about parents, children, and understanding the process and language difficulties, and the whole question about the benefits of inclusion. First of all, I would say I don't think this is, there may be specific issues for people where English is a second language, where they would need additional help, but that applies in all walks of life. My own sense is that when we turn to the question of what your child needs, particularly when we're talking about youngsters with special needs, I don't think it's unique to people where English is a second language, people will tell you it's a minefield trying to figure out what's there, who you talk to, where you go. And the real issue about that, which actually, you know, I hope we can do something with using the existing legislation. The real issue there are actually parent support groups. We've got to actually learn to nurture them and make them a more central part of the process, and make them part of the legislation that says you've got to hear what parents and young people are saying. Real, and I think that's the bit that I would want to concentrate on. In terms of the issue about, you know, friends, inclusion, participation, we heard, you know, about school sports and that. I mean, I kind of think, that, and you may not share this view with me, but I kind of think that the challenge here is where you have specialist schools, how well those specialist schools work with other schools and work with the rest of the community. And I was struck when you were talking about the, you know, the one least trained member of staff. You know, if you go to something like Treehouse School, which specialises for youngsters with autism, you see a staff ratio of about 3 or 4 to 1. If you go to somewhere like Oakfield in Nottingham, you see very high staff numbers. If you go to the Epilepsy Centre down in Kent, you see...
My question was specific to mainstream.
I understand. I understand where I'm coming. But the point I'm making is, what we recognise in specialist provision is a need for a much better staff ratio, and you get, when you turn to the mainstream sector, you get that turned on its head. That's your point. So I think that it is about how you make the mainstream work with the specialist sector. I think that's really important. In terms of specific things you asked about training, I mean, I don't know what the cost of developing work in the Children and Families Bill is to date, but I actually know fine well that one justification for not ripping it up and starting all over again is that'd be a whole lot of additional costs rather than making what we've got work.
I think my point there is that any changes, there will be a justifiable or unjustifiable cost. But as it stands, there is a cost because it has happened.
Yep.
Specifically, where is the training within all this? If we're talking about outcomes for children, where is the training?
Absolutely. Well, I'm simply making the point that, of course, if you decide to start all over again, you are generating a whole host of other costs. We said specifically that all teacher training must have a component of it. This isn't far enough for yourself, I appreciate, but all teacher training will need to have a component or module now that tries to deal with special education needs. I'm very, well, the reason why I frame it in those terms is, if I was to actually try to organise teacher training for every single group that's been to see me in the last 2 years, then teacher training would have to have a module for almost every disability or difficulty you care to imagine. It isn't going to happen, and I'm just being straight with you. So what we're going to devise is a special needs module. We're going to invite the various organisations and lobby groups and agencies to contribute to that training. And the key component is not what you do in your basic teacher training, it's also the amount of continuous professional development that you get post your initial training, and that, of course, as you well know, is totally absent in lots of local authorities. And in fact, that's an area where, strangely enough, in terms of cost, nearly every organisation that has a particular interest in a particular special needs area could actually contribute something many of them already do. So that's how we think we would tackle it, and we think that is the most practical way to begin to flip this model on its head, where you get 4 to 1 if you're in specialist sector and about 1/4 to 1 if you're in the other sector.
Thank you. Just to take Chair's privilege here, I think there are many situations here, Steve, where parents, again, issued to be focused on teacher training. We have known in teacher education that often units have been add-on. What's been asked is, as disability equality training, as an integral component part of teacher education. And we know there are numerous impairment groups. However, there is a common cause to disabled people's experience of discrimination that is not addressed in teacher education. And I think that's the point.
Yeah,
I'll allow you to come back.
I'll take that.
Jonathan.
Thanks. Sorry, did you say you'd end selection? I didn't hear your answer to that.
No, sorry, if the question was, are we going to abolish grammar schools, if that's what you mean by end selection, actually, no. Are we going to do anything about illegal exclusions? Well, yes, we are, because they are illegal at the moment, and actually what you have to do is make it clear to head teachers and chairs of governors that they're actually breaking the law, and if needs be, we'll prosecute them. We will end illegal exclusions. We're not going to abolish grammar schools, no.
Okay.
Well, honesty is always the best policy for me.
The question you asked, what's Labour's response to the Green Party, not what do you think of the Green Party? Naive is believing that Labour is in any way a party of the excluded or those who are on the margins anymore, I'm afraid. You only have to hear Rachel Reeves' comments, the work and pension spokesman, last week, saying Labour is not a party of the unemployed, it is not a party of those on welfare. If you don't believe me, go and look it up. It's an interview with The Guardian, it's in black and white. Naive is believing that you can invest the necessary resources in public services and still follow the Tory part of austerity, which is what Labour are committed to. Let's be absolutely clear here. They just voted for this man just voted for £30 billion worth of austerity cuts in the House of Commons about 5 weeks ago, was it?
Well, I didn't, but which question are you answering at the moment?
I'm just responding to your questions.
No, I just asking.
We would end selection. We would absolutely end selection. My wife works in Brixton with kids at risk of exclusion. I think the difficulty with saying blanketly you will end exclusion, which is something that Lambeth Council thought about doing, and then talked to Parents for Inclusion. Parents for Inclusion were slightly dubious about it because what you get is internal exclusion, effectively a child excluded within a school, and I think that's the biggest danger. So to make a blanket, we will never exclude, runs that risk, and so I think we've got to be really careful about making sweeping statements about ending exclusion. But I'm horrified by what Children's Commission have found. 2 years ago now, if you are a black male child with SEN, you are what, something like 160 times more likely to be excluded than the white middle class female. It's outrageous and it has to be addressed. I don't think a blanket exclusion is the way, but coming back to the point about statements and the health and social care plans moving us towards that more medical model, I think it does erect more barriers. I know with our son, when he tried to get into primary school, there was no idea of an education based around the child and meeting Sammy. What they saw was a block of paper about this thick, and they saw all the barriers to his inclusion. And with a health and social care plan, you get a hell of a lot more barriers when you're trying to get a child into your school, because you get all the medical stuff as well as the education stuff. And so I think there's a real risk there, and we need to focus on making those more inclusion statements that address the barriers to a child's education, and with it comes support.
The question about EAL, focus on EAL for parents who speak
English as a second language.
Yes.
So I'm fighting quite hard at Lambeth College around these issues. A lot of staffing cuts. I've been on picket lines with them. Yes, we need interpretation and training for teachers, absolutely. The friendship and social skills issue that Sarifa also mentioned is absolutely crucial. And it's a dimension that's really missing, particularly around play. One of the points in the Green Party manifesto is that play really needs to be facilitated in the playground. It isn't just about kicking the kids out, being away from lessons and letting them get on with it. And this is for all children. Their play needs to be encouraged and facilitated outside as part of their schooling. And that's part of developing their social skills, which is a side which just really isn't addressed at school. We want compulsory PSHE in schools. Caroline Lucas tabled a bill in the House of Commons, with I think some cross-party support in that respect. That part of developing that social education is absolutely crucial. It needs to happen in the play as well as in the lesson time. Coming on to, what's the next? Training for teachers. I mean, the turnover of teachers at schools is absolutely colossal, and I think this is an issue that maybe wasn't in the question but also needs to be addressed as part of this, is that teachers are being overloaded with their testing and their assessments and their inspections, and so there isn't time for the investment and quality investment in the teaching and training at school that they absolutely need. And we need to value teachers far more, and as long as we have this culture in schools, that isn't going to be addressed. Yes, there needs to be absolutely mandatory quality training across all the protected characteristics. We're good on some, we're lousy on disability, and that needs to be mandatory both in teacher training college and in schools as well. I think that's a clear, unequivocal answer. If I missed anything out, come back, because I was taking a lot of notes. So.
Thank you.
What's next?
I'm going to do 3 questions, then we'll have a short break. Okay. So, Susie, Yvonne, and Yuande.
Right, I'm probably one of the few teachers here. I've taught for 42 years in Hackney, and what the Green Party is describing isn't at all idealistic. It's exactly what we had before Labour and the Tories began to interfere. So, what we had then was we were taught properly how to teach in primary schools. For 3 years we studied all of it in detail, and then we were trusted and we taught through play. We taught children with EAL. I taught always in Hackney working class primary schools with EAL.
Question.
No, I do. Well, other people spoke more than this before they asked the question, sorry. So the point is we had that. Labour came in and made a very rigid primary curriculum. It was the first time ever I saw little boys not wanting to go to school because they had to sit for too long, not in my class, but in some. The Tories carried on with it. And so in Finland, they learn through play until they're 7, and they have the highest results in Europe. They do not have testing. Last night I was at Hustings at an education question time at Stoke Newington School, and all the teachers there said the main thing that stopped them feeling they could do inclusion properly was the testing and the league tables and the obsession with it. So they'd stopped doing art, music and drama. They'd stopped having all the discussions we used to have. Disability bullying is now the highest bullying there is. The Anti-Bullying Alliance has said that. I never had that because the children discussed and they had empathy with each other. The training that Labour persons talked about is what Rich has been doing for the since 1990 in schools throughout the country. It was called Disability Equality Training, and they trained thousands and thousands of teachers, and it was very highly valued. The government supported it, then stopped supporting it. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We know how to train teachers. And my question is, now we're the most tested primary children in Europe. And it does stress them, it does stress teachers. Teachers are leaving in droves, brilliant teachers are leaving in droves. And now at 6 you're a failure if you actually do a test of a nonsense word and you try to make sense of it, you're a failure. At 4 they're now going to test you. The new test at 4 is, do you know what the new test at 4 is? Say the word seesaw, now say it without the saw. If you get that wrong, you're a failure at 4. So will the Labour Party say that they are going to stop testing and league tables and SACs because they do not support learning? Teachers have always assessed their children. Advisors have always come in. All the outside people coming to stress people and to test them does not work. And the Green Party have said that, but Labour hasn't, and I think it's shameful because I always used to vote for Labour before.
Thank you, Susie. Yvonne.
My question is about assistance in school. My daughter had always one-to-one at school, so there was no. It was not the point of that she had a shortage of support, but the support workers or teacher assistants at schools and colleges, they don't know how she communicates, they don't know how she learns. And there was no connection with the world outside school and home. So she could never, what happened at school, take that home. So it was just two different worlds. And I gave as much as possible information about it, but there's often a lot of new people coming and going. So there's a lot of change of assistants as well. And they simply didn't know. At one point I asked, can she bring her own PA, because she knows how my daughter communicates, how she learns. And after a long time that happened, after quite some struggle that happened, and then for the first time she was able to communicate with teachers, with other students, and to talk through what was in the curriculum, in the syllabus. And she could make homework at home and she loved it. And the assistant, she adapted it all, and in the end she achieved even the course. So that was great. What my question is what, a year ago, so I read that via the green paper that it would be possible that children would bring their PAs to school, but now often schools and colleges refuse disabled students to bring their own personal assistants in school to support them. So what's your view on this, and what would you do to change this?
Thank you, and Yolandi?
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I'm a disabled young person. Schools and colleges often refuse to support disabled children and young people in developing friendships, as they say their only focus is on education, and that friendships and social inclusion have nothing to do with them. What will you do to change this? And I know that you have anti-bullying policies, I know there is PSHE, I know that there are initiatives such as Circle of Friends, but still we're going wrong. Still there's isolation, and disabled children and young people are being left out. I know because it happened to me throughout my whole school career. So my question is, what are you going to do to ensure that when kids who don't have disabilities walk into school with an inclusive mindset and they see disabled children and young people as their peers and as on the same level as them, so that they can make friendships with them? Because right now, that's not happening. I've just read a report that says about, I can't remember, a very large percentage of 18 to 25-year-olds are even scared to start up a conversation with a disabled person, and that's outrageous.
Thank you. Again, just to try and encapsulate what has been asked, Susie joined from personal experience with 40 years of teaching, witnessing the no testing regime, mentioned the issue of disabled bullying specifically, the training had been going on in the past and why you invent the wheel, teacher stress, mentioned an example of proposals for tests for 4-year-olds, and the direct question was to stop league tables and SATs tests. Thank you, Susie. Yvonne, again, drew upon personal experience, talking about assistance, daughter having one-to-one, a communication impairment, again working with an individual PA, and the barriers that she's experienced through the schooling system and at college. And again, direct question is, what are the political representatives got something to say about PAs being supported and employed as part of that individual's support within a school or college environment?
So the PA is employed by the disabled young person?
Yeah, so the personal assistant is employed by the individual. And Yolandi's questions about schools and colleges, about when is it the level playing field is going to be made between non-disabled and disabled people about equality issues and the social inclusion agenda around friendships and peers and feeling valued on a level playing field. Hope that's encapsulated those questions. On this occasion, Jonathan, can I ask you?
I think, Susie, yours is more a question for Labour, so...
Yeah.
Well, I agree with you. Yvonne, yeah, we were just chatting before about getting the struggle to get a PA into school. I know it would have been brilliant for Sam to have had it. I'll be honest, I don't think the Green Party has a policy on it. Clearly, the Green Party needs a policy on it. We're a democratic structure, so what I will commit to doing is trying to make that a part of policy. I will bring it to the next conference, I will table it, and we'll try and get it adopted, because I think it is a great idea. I don't know why I haven't thought about pushing it forward with the Green Party before. Thank you. I can see there might be some issues around employment rights and a few things pragmatically working through, and I don't know how you've managed, because you're in a school as a...
There are different, even different ways possible.
And I think there are probably some employment issues about advertising a job and having to have an interview process and a proper selection and a quality selection process, which probably need to be addressed, but I'm sure they could be overcome. Around friendships and social inclusion, I think what you've got in education at the moment is a one-size-fits-all policy, and it's based around primarily academic education. What the Green Party wants to do is have a child-centred approach, recognises that all children are diverse and they're all different, and they all need to have a curriculum that caters for that. So one of the things that kind of destroys some social relationships at school is that, particularly in primary schools, you get the tables, classes of where streamed, get one table where you get high academic achievers, and then the other table where you have low academic achievers, and often the relationships are broken up by that process. We wouldn't do that. We would get rid of streaming within classrooms, because we think that social element is absolutely crucial, and that's part of a child-centred approach. Sam was involved in circles of friends. I mean, what's fascinating is that we have it written in his statement, because we recognise that socialisation is really important, but you also have to frame it in educational terms in order to get it into the statement. Everything has to be justified in educational terms. And there should be that liberty to write things into statements that do encompass that socialisation. But what we found is, even with it written into a statement, the schools don't know what it is. The schools don't know what a circle of friends. They think it's just about a group of people getting together and sitting in a circle. They don't realise that there's a whole ethos behind it. There's a whole element that you have to be trained up in it, and it needs to be made to happen. And I think there's a huge journey that sections of the teaching profession need to go on, and schools need to go on. And that's going to happen through the resourcing, it's going to happen through the right training at teacher training college, it's going to have the right happen through the right training at schools, but also putting more accountability in the hands of parents. Because it's very hard. Sam was at an academy. My wife's just become a governor at that academy, and finds she's got no power whatsoever, really, as a governor. She can try and influence and she can try and push, but she hasn't. If we bring that parental accountability back in under local authority, which will happen under local authority control in a partnership with the local authority, then you can actually get these things brought into the school, and you can make these things happen, and you can get the school working with parents for it to happen.
Thank you, John.
Well, Susie, I don't think there's much chance that I'm going to be able to say what you want to hear, so I may as well be honest at the start. I was struck by the fact that you said you got 42 years experience, and I was thinking about that, because that means you must have started teaching around the time we had educational priority areas. And the reason we had them, of course, is because of the massive differences that were occurring in the range of education we offered to kids coming from different backgrounds, sometimes within the same geographic area. And you must remember why that was introduced. And of course you will also remember that during this period, the idea that inclusion, you said, I was struck, and I understood the point, but I was struck by the fact that you said inclusion was stopped by testing. Well, of course, actually, that's not true, because we haven't come from a golden age of inclusion to a period where it's been stopped by testing. Actually, when I was a child, growing up on the west coast of Scotland, we used to have a thing called the wee grey bus, and that was the thing that came round housing areas and picked up all the kids who had already been written off because they had a special need or a disability, and they were all carted off to this written off special school. So it's not the case that testing in itself has actually resulted in that. In my own experience.
Sorry, sir, I didn't say that. I said that last night at a meeting. I said last night at a meeting, teachers said they found all the testing, the main thing that was stopping inclusion. That's what they said last night at the meeting. That doesn't come from me.
Well, anyway, the point I'm making, I did say at the beginning I wasn't really satisfied for you. I'm making the point that actually, if you look at educational priority areas, we haven't come from a golden age. If you look at the problems of testing, which is the one area where I'm about to agree with Susie, they haven't in themselves been the major impediment in the past to inclusion. There have been a whole series of other factors, and the most startling factor was that people were written off before they even got to education, segregated by the school right at the start that they were sent to. That's the point that I'm making there. Actually, where I do agree with you is I think there is far too much testing. I think you're absolutely right about that. And I have to say, I actually think Ofsted has entirely lost its way. It's suffering from what most of us would call role confusion at the moment. It's collecting data that's hardly analysed in any meaningful way. Most of it's fairly redundant data. It seems to confuse the role with an improvement agency, with an inspection agency, and at times you get both. And of course, when directed by the Secretary of State, they can go in subsequently and find what they're looking for, having been unable to find it in earlier inspections. So there is a massive argument for actually changing that. I haven't been to Finland myself, but I know actually I know that Kevin Brennan, who's a member of the Shadow Education team, who's primarily concerned with school standards, has been, and we are actually quite interested in some aspects of the model in Finland. Certainly what I would say to you, and I just want to be clear that I'm not kidding anybody on the line, we have no plans at the moment to abolish SATs. We do think that league tables are probably past their sell-by date, and if they're going to continue to exist in any shape or form, what they actually have to be is a description of the school's strengths and weaknesses, something that parents can use for comparison purposes. I've mentioned what we do about Ofsted.
So just for the record, you're considering abolishing league tables? Just my press release tomorrow.
You can write your own press release.
Yeah, no, so you're not actually saying that, are you? Really? You're not saying that.
Jonathan, you can write your own press release and you can make it up as you see fit. That's what you normally do.
Look at the fine print, Brendan, look at the fine print and what he's saying.
Well, if we had to look at the fine print, we would have to look at what the leader of the Green Party's been saying. She's been saying it rather well. But yeah, I'd like to move on. But what I was going to say to you actually was, I think there is an issue about assessment. We don't want to get rid of assessment, but you can, and most teachers, you would probably agree with this, will tell you, you can do much more quality of assessment yourself, and that is really what we should work on there. Yvonne, look, you talked, I thought the most graphic way you described it was you talked about it being two different worlds. And that's often how it feels to the young person, and it's often how it feels to their parents. And I think that gets absolutely right. I kind of, you might think I am hopelessly idealistic or hopelessly naive, but I kind of think actually education, health and care plans could go some way to addressing some of the things. I think that's the point. They are not statements. They are much broader than statements, and I think they may go some way towards developing some of the things that you you are concerned about, because it is trying to understand the whole person and their needs in a variety of situations and settings. And if they are done properly, which was the thing you raised at the beginning, I think they could make an improvement. You asked specifically about the idea of taking a PA to school with you. I did a speech to an SEND conference earlier this year. I think it was actually last year, I think about now, called The Future of the SEND Workforce. And one of the things I was arguing was that schools and school governors were going to actually have to change the way they functioned, because they were going to have to recognise that this workforce was changing. And in an era of personalisation, it is much more likely that people may well want and need to bring someone like a PA to school. Now, the current, I'm not saying every single school, but the current reaction in most schools is they would find a way of telling you why that couldn't be done. That is something that we will have to adapt and will have to change, in my view. And I think, look, I'd like to sit here and sort of curry favour and say, hey, look, it's all going to happen tomorrow. I can't tell you that, and I'm not going to give you on. But I actually think you are right about what you're saying, and I think that's what we have to move to. And I think both schools and the workforce will have to adapt to accommodate that. And finally, Andy, look, there's three bits to what you said that I just want to mention. The first thing, again, I think, just as I've been saying to Yvonne, I think education, health and care plans could be a way of seeing the totality of the person rather than the slightly more segmented view that we tend to do at the moment. But the test of that is to come. In terms of the actual legislation I talked about at the beginning, in a way, the local offer is going to be part of what determines how much people with special needs get space and support to participate in broader stream society. We have a very good play, John mentioned play schemes and the importance of play earlier. We have a very good one in Birmingham, in my area, called Dens of Equality, which is under massive pressure on its funding, but actually does a very good job of trying to bring children with special needs and disabilities together with other children. And I think there is a real importance there. And my own son actually attended a school which did actually have quite a good inclusion policy. Now, I'm not saying this to make it sound good, but he used to come home and talk to me about his pals at school. This is secondary school. He used to come home and talk about his pals at school. And actually, it turned out that one of his pals had a disability, but I didn't know for months until I actually bumped into all of them together, because when he'd spoken about it, that is not the way he had described it. And so the sense of that I took out of it was, this was an example of inclusion working well. It's not, I don't think myself, there are things you can do with bits of lessons and that, but I don't think that's the key to it. I think the key to it is, if a school is going to have an inclusion policy, it has to start with the head, the governors, and the SENCO, and usually the SENCO has to be part of the senior management team if they're going to have any significant influence on that. And that's the thing, it's the culture you generate from there that I think makes a difference. And I think there are examples of that working, but they're not widespread enough, and our job has got to be to make them more widespread.
Thank you. Apologies, folks, that you're not going to have a break, and you're going to have the final round of questions.
Can I say, people need to go to the loo, please just go.
Yeah, absolutely. Apologies for that. One of the questions I'd like you to address relates to representation and aspirations of disabled young people to pursue higher education. Currently, 16% of the disabled population, these are government figures, 16% of disabled people who are able to pursue potentially higher education, of that 16%, only 3.8% have careers in higher education. So I want you to address the issue of aspirations and pursuing higher education. Hannah.
I wanted to ask a question about differentiating the curriculum and about further education after 16. Currently, there's two parts to the question. Currently, it's very hard. I work as a PA and I've supported a young girl with learning difficulties in further education, being included in a mainstream course. And I found that it's very hard for young disabled people, particularly people with learning difficulties, to actually access further education. Within the schools and colleges that I've come across, people say, well, we can't have inclusion because it's done on an achievement basis. You have to be able to achieve the level 1 to get onto the course. But no kind of thought about how there might be adaptations to help someone achieve that level 1 is made. Secondly, because it's achievement-based, rather than in compulsory education, where someone can be included in education with their peers, that can't happen if someone feels not able or is not able to achieve that level. So my question is, because the college receives funding based on whether they will pass, so my question is, what will you do to make sure that these students can work alongside their peers, learning and doing the same things as them, whilst either achieving the level that they can achieve, or, if that's seen as impossible or they don't want to do it, achieving something which is still challenging for them and is still an achievement and doesn't make them feel different to the others, but can still be included. For example, like the AQA EPQ, Extended Project Qualifications, or Arts Awards, things that can be adapted. But also, that will require training in inclusion. And so it worries me that the Labour representative said that the mainstream school should learn from special schools. From my opinion and my experience, having members who support students within the separate area of the college, the ALN department, the additional learning needs, I think, department, absolutely don't know what to do when they come to support a student in mainstream, because it's an entirely different process. So my question is, how will you train people to adapt and differentiate curriculum and ensure inclusion in that way? So it's a kind of three-part question.
Thank you. Zelda.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, Mr. McCabe, Steve McCabe, you said that it was the culture of the school that made the difference, and it had to come from the head. I absolutely agree with you. I'm a nursery teacher, retired now, but for 30-odd years, in a very inclusive school, where all neighbourhood children were included well in the school. And I think what made it so successful is that everybody was on board, and there was continual education development throughout the school. So my question is, there should be an absolute commitment to inclusive education. And I don't think schools' initial teacher training should be about trying to have that as an added-on element. It should be part and parcel. Every good teacher can teach any child, I believe. It's about child development. It's about putting children in the centre and learn. And as Susie said, it's about knowing about children and how children learn. And that's what our teachers should be doing in their teacher training. So that's my question. How will you make the culture happen? And how will, it should be absolutely every child's right to go to a mainstream school. And how are we going to make that possible?
Thank you. And finally, Lucia.
Okay. So we talked already about the possibility of having too much assessment. But I think it's about the curriculum as a whole, and how that is failing so many students at the moment, including disabled students, but also students who have different learning styles. And I just wondered what the intentions are to actually make the curriculum more flexible and creative, so that young people can feel fully included and can actually be educated in a way that they can feel comfortable, rather than a way that's just pressurising people and making them feel like they're a failure. And I also think earlier earlier on, we talked about the Children and Families Act and how these 5 caveats are still failing disabled young people who want to be included in their local mainstream schools. So I'm just going to cut to the chase and say, well, what are the parties going to do to ensure that inclusive education is a right and not a struggle?
Okay, in similar fashion, question I posed around aspirations, teachers, again to address the balance of academic staff within higher education, underrepresented when it comes to disabled staff. Question from Hannah about differentiation in FE, specifically focusing on individuals with the label of learning difficulties in FE, and the issue of achievement-based work. And what are the parties doing to support individuals described as having learning difficulties to being as a right to mainstream, inclusive college life, school life, and dispelling the mythology about specialist staff I heard, about specialist staff assuming to have this somehow expert knowledge. Question from Zelda about affirming the top-down approach coming from management, commitment to inclusive education, avoid this notion of trying, and the point that every teacher is a teacher of special educational needs. And again, just to make the point, not all disabled people have special educational needs, by the way. And finally, Lucia, who made the point about curriculum flexibility, about an inclusive, accessible curriculum, and ensure that inclusive education is a right. John.
Yeah, a lot of those questions kind of overlap, so maybe I'll take them all together. I mean, I'm coming back again to the child-centred learning issue, that we do need that curriculum flexibility, but it takes a certain amount of resourcing to do that. So we're experiencing that at Samuel School at the moment. He isn't going to, they tried to differentiate the curriculum, they are failing. What he actually needs is a different set of achievement goals that are lower. Or no, not lower, they are more tailored to his abilities that he's going to enjoy and he's going to thrive in, and that means buying it in. They haven't had it at the school before, so there needs to be a training programme. But of course, if they had more children like Samuel at that school, then it would make sense and it would already be in place. And so inclusion is absolutely fundamental, and that right to inclusion is absolutely fundamental, and until we actually make that step, these issues are not going to be sorted out. And that's why in the Green Party manifesto this year is in black and white: every child has a right to an inclusive education. It should be a right, it is a right, it must be a right. And there's no watering that down. When you get that right, and when you get acceptance of that right, that's half the battle. Then you've got to put in the resourcing to provide that curriculum flexibility. So Hannah, in your point about, I know we've discussed this before, but to have children studying the same subject, but to aspire to maybe different levels within that subject. So they are all achieving within that subject. They're learning together, they're learning the same things, but they're going to different levels within that subject area, and that is appropriate for higher education as well. It needs to be mixed ability. What have I not covered? Higher education, I mean, one of the big barriers is cost, and it is even harder if your job prospects are not as good as other people's jobs prospects. To come out of university with huge amounts of debt is going to be quite problematic. It's going to be a barrier. Education should be free, and we need to pay for it. And that means, so we need to get rid of tuition fees, and we need to provide proper maintenance grants again. And it should be paid for by the big business who are going to make a lot of money out of these graduates. It's the right thing to do. They are benefiting from it. We need to, it is not naive, it's just raising corporation tax to the level of the rest of the G7. The point is, in this country, we give big business far too many tax breaks. The corporation tax is much lower than the G7 average. We favour them. All we're saying, raise it to the level of the other big countries in the world, and you can pay for your higher education. After all, they're getting the benefit from it. When you do that, it opens up higher education to people, to everyone to access. I think aspiration, Hannah, is absolutely crucial, and it's desperately lacking within our schools, particularly when we have a celebration of high academic achievement. Children aren't their aspirations, we aren't taught to dream about our children and aspire and think from a very early age to set out what the plans are and what we want to see them achieve when they are teenagers, when they are, do you want to go to university or another vocational course, what work do you want to do, and that's part of the socialisation question. It's about getting together with friends, and my son Sammy wants to be a taxi driver, and we've encouraged him to go for that. I'm hoping that technology will be there when he's old enough to drive, that it will facilitate that, and I'm encouraging him to dream. I'm not playing those aspirations down, and so we will try and support that through his education to make sure he has the right qualifications and goes for that. Hopefully we believe we can aspire to that and one day manage to do that. But it has to start at a very early age, and so we have to dream for our children, and we have to be encouraged to dream for our children. At the moment, I'm afraid the system works against that. Until we fundamentally change the system, that isn't going to happen. That aspiration is going to happen from the start.
Sorry, the part of the question was that the levels, the colleges only get funding if they can pass the exam. So how would you change that so that people could be included on this course?
Well, first of all, you don't want it to be purely an exam-based system. So you want to have it as part of coursework at a higher education level. You don't want it all to be on the final exam. Secondly, you've got to make it possible for those milestones to be reached at different levels. So, on one course, someone getting the funding, you might expect them to achieve a certain level, someone else would achieve a lower level, so you give the funding accordingly. Yes, they need to achieve, they need to aspire, they need to be able to attain those levels to get the funding, but the levels need to be different and the curriculum needs to be differentiated.
Well, in terms of higher education, I think the biggest fear right this minute is actually, probably this also applies to FE, but certainly to higher education, it's the threat to the DSA. That's almost certainly the biggest thing that's the problem there. And there's a slight spin-off of that. Actually, this country has quite a significant lead in technology production, which is, strangely enough, one of our successful little export industries. And one of the reasons why it flourishes is partly because the DSA means that people are quite often looking to buy specialist equipment to support their education and training. And if that gets abolished and taken out of the system, not only will we disadvantage people's chances of accessing it, we will manage to kill a rather successful little export industry simultaneously. The other thing I think that affects education more broadly, but I think applies to higher education, is actually the rules governing teachers. At the moment, it's pretty hard to get a teaching job if you've got a disability because of the rules we actually have in place. And the easiest thing to do if you really want to demonstrate a broader inclusion strategy would actually be to relax those rules and stop making it so hard for people with a disability to access the world of teaching. Specifically, Hannah, look, I think that FE, there are obviously exceptions to this, but my experience is that FE is not well equipped to cope with people with special needs at all. They invariably say they are, and actually what happens is people are then admitted to the institution, and that's what it's like, because they then find themselves in the additional learnings unit, which means they're segregated for big chunks of the day. The most classic, I'm not saying this is exclusive, but the most classic example of that are for people on the autistic spectrum who end up moving to a situation where the basic structure that they are often familiar with that helps and improves their functioning in the course of the day is taken away from them. And not surprisingly, in a very short space of time of going to the college, the whole thing just falls apart. So, and I did see a stat somewhere that says that if you don't make a successful transition to training or education at the point of 16, and you do have some kind of special education needs, the odds are within 2 years you will definitely be a NEET, and your chances of getting a job after that are about zilch. So, that is fundamentally what's problematic. I came across a group of parents in Birmingham who started their own post-16 training college because there was such a dearth of facilities. And it's possibly about the only thing you can say about Michael Gove's free school programme is that in some cases it's actually allowed some parents to compensate for the dearth of facilities elsewhere. You asked specifically, what do we do about the funding, and I would be straight with you. I don't know. I wish I could give you a glib answer, but I'm not honestly sure. I think there are two possibilities. You could look at extending the concept of pupil premium so that it follows the individual into that sector, and I'm quite attracted to that. But in a time of constrained financial needs and where we don't have the same tax plans as other folk, I'm not sure that I can say tonight that we would do that. Equally, actually, that personal independence payments could be adapted, providing you got a real grip on how they were spent, and they were spent in favour of the individual. They may have some possibilities there. Zelda, look, I agree also with you about the basic point you make about it's about the attitude of the teacher, and good teachers can teach anyone. I'm sure that is fundamentally true. And maybe I was a bit too different when I said we're going to try to include a component, but look, what I'm trying to say to you is we need to recognise that basic teacher training needs a more substantial component that actually gives teachers a bit of basic grounding and competence in what they're doing. Now, if I was too different in the way I described it, I apologise, but it's easy for me to come along and sound gung-ho about these things. I'm trying to tell you, and you know, with the greatest respect to Susie, I was maybe a bit dismissive when you talked about your 40-odd years experience. All my experience in social work has been about the difficulties that people have and the offers that they're made that are then not translated into reality. And so if I'm a bit different, that's what it's based on. But I also have to say, like, you know, it's okay to talk about people's rights, but rights are only of any value if they're translated into real possibilities and real actions. And you can, you know, it's easy to have charters of rights, unless there's something substantial behind them that delivers them. They are actually just hot air, and that's what I'm sceptical about. And I'm also going to defend the right of parents and young people to have what they regard as good quality specialist education. So you're quite right to say that your child should be able to go to a mainstream school and have all the support that they need to help them survive. But if you really want to send your child to the National Institute for Conductive Education or to a specialist school that does something in particular with deaf children or with children on the autism spectrum, you should have that right as well. I think the key to that is there is a world of difference between high-quality specialist settings that really want to reach into the community and work with it and bridge the gap, and segregated additional learning units which are about hiding folk away in the basement or the cupboard. I think my own view is they are two rather different things. Lucia, just finally, you talked about wanting this kind of broad, flexible curriculum so that, I guess really what you're saying, so that we can recognise and encourage everyone's talents. Well, you know, I could hardly disagree with you, but actually that is an argument for not having too tightly a prescribed curriculum, and it is one of the anxieties when people say this should be a statutory part of the curriculum, that should be a statutory part, this should be... Because you end up where Susie is by saying, well, there was a time when I thought I had the freedom to teach, and now I'm just some kind of functional technician who's been told what I've got to deliver. That is the danger of going down that route. It is one argument for saying maybe less prescription about the curriculum, and you made your absolute straightforward pitch at the end. Look, I think I've told you, what we're going to do is we're going to review the admissions code. We will adjust it to try and address the things that Richard talked about earlier. I'm not clear. I'll tell you one thing we learned from Michael Gove, and I'll just ask you to think about this, and I'll make this my last remark. Michael Gove demonstrated to the Labour Party that you don't need acres and acres of legislation to make changes. He did just about everything that's happened in the education world in the last 5 years by ministerial diktat and statutory instrument and special order. So it isn't necessary that we legislate for some of this stuff to change it. There are other ways faster ways and sometimes more efficient ways. And sadly, I have to admit that's one lesson I have learned from a man I've not got a lot of time for.
Can I just say, I wasn't actually, with all respect, I wasn't sort of talking about whether we should have inclusion or segregation, but more about what will you be doing as a Labour Party to ensure that people, and I think actually I disagree, I think legislation here is the key, because at the moment there are parents who are being denied the rights to send their child to an inclusive school. So what are you actually going to do to change that?
And young people as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think as a reflective point at this point in the proceedings, I'm going to have to bring this to a close. However, just to thank everybody for the questions, and again, the questions relating to choice is what we discussed earlier. But in order to sum up, I would like the representative to make 2 minutes representations each, given the points being heard tonight, and to summarise your key pitch. So, let's start with Jonathan. I'm going to be strict on this timing, folks, so bear with us. And
final bit. Lucia, I think you hit the nail on the head. What are Labour going to actually do? I have not heard one thing during this whole time from Labour what they can actually do. That is why it's important to vote for Green. So, I mean, Labour are dangling a few things in front of you. You've heard lots of yes, you're right, that point's very important. Yes, I'm repeating back to you what you said, but I'm not actually going to tell you what I'm going to do. They might consider perhaps thinking about doing something about league tables. Okay? They might re-examine admissions criteria. They won't in selection, we know that much. Don't know what they'll do about the curriculum, but they might do something. They might do something about academies, but what? Further education is not well equipped, but they've not said what they're going to do about it. Labour know the problems. They can repeat them back to you, but there is no funding, no resourcing. I came here quite positive about Labour from my experiences, and I've gone away far less positive. The more you look at it, the more it falls short. There is no vision here. There are no real proposals here. I'm afraid this is sad. And the stakes are very, very high, because we are at a point, a crucial point, where we've reached a consensus around Labour and Tories around education, around the same vision, which is an acceptance of segregation. It is an acceptance of markets in the education system, and we are on a road towards privatisation of the education system, and that is not good news for the people in this room and their friends and their families. Labour, I do not believe, get inclusion if they ever did. They believe that inclusion is integration. They believe that inclusion is a one-size-fits-all policy. That is not what the Greens believe. The Greens believe that when you include a child, the environment changes, and it changes for the better. You have good teachers when they understand inclusion, and everyone benefits from that higher level of teaching, because those teachers get inclusion. And the class environment is therefore a better class environment, and the children are better educated because there is an understanding of inclusion. Rights have value, as my Labour colleague said, and I will agree with him on that, when there is something behind it. There is something behind it with the Green Party. I'm afraid there is nothing at the moment behind it with Labour.
Well, as I said to you at the beginning, we think that the priority at the moment is to make the children and families at work. We think that it's right to put a huge emphasis on the implementation and getting it right. We want to work with parents, we want to work with local organisations and lobby groups to make that happen. I tried to give you some very clear ideas about the things we're interested in terms of early identification, early intervention, the kind of models of schools and the structure of the schools that we're interested in, how we think directors of standards of innovation can make a difference to that sort of approach, how bringing schools together to work with families can make a difference to that approach. I'm somebody who doesn't believe. I've had enough experience in politics of listening to people who tell me it's all going to be done tomorrow and it's all easy. I don't believe that. I don't resort to that. Nor do I actually think that I've got to start from the position of saying because this person's in a different party, I've got to disagree with every single thing they say. So I hope I've given you enough clue, and I hope those of you who aren't wearing your green tinted spectacles tonight will have heard some of what I was saying, as opposed to Jonathan, who didn't.
Thank you. Just invite closing comments from
it's really just an opportunity. I mean, we had to start late. I mean, we know that, and I've no doubt there'll be some people in the room who had a burning question that they weren't able to ask. We will be following up with everybody to make sure we capture all of those questions, and we will be sending them to Jonathan and to Steve and to the invisible members of the panel. I mean, I think from ALLFIE's perspective, you know, I think there's probably nobody that would say that they don't support inclusion. I think where it's going to start to get much more difficult for politicians, etc., is when you're prepared to stand up and say you're against segregation. And I think if you really want to understand the lifetime impact of segregation, I would suggest talking to disabled people. Stop talking to the traditional service providers who will paint an incredibly romantic view of segregated provision being an exceptional experience. But for those of us that experienced it, it was well, exceptional but incredibly damaging. And we will be following that up with each of the parties. So, and the other thing to know is that this has been filmed today and will be put up on YouTube in the next few days, and I really recommend people look at it and remember some of what the politicians in the room talked about today in terms of how we proceed after the 7th of May.
Thank you very much. Can I just say, we have got the room, and if people do want to stay, we've got up to 10 past, so we've got about 5 minutes. But please can we start thinking of vacating the premises around just after 10 past. I just want to say thanks very much for that.